75 now, and I can't remember anybody except the Queen.
The Grand State Gala was supposed to be an evening of flawless smiles, rigid protocol, and absolute house solidarity. But in a single, breathless instant, Princess Catherine caught sight of the ornament pinned to Camilla's gown, and the energy in the room completely shifted. This wasn't a replica, nor was it a vague tribute. It was Diana's personal brooch, the exact historic heirloom Catherine believed should never be displayed without genuine intent, proper consent, or deep reverence. In that precise second, the Princess of Wales did something completely unprecedented. Before we dive into the deep operational fallout this caused behind closed doors, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an official update. Catherine didn't look away. She didn't blink. For several long moments, she remained absolutely motionless, as if her physical senses registered the profound shock before her voice could even articulate it. From across the table, Camilla felt that piercing gaze lock onto her, sharp and unmistakable. Instantly, the Queen Consort's hand twitched toward the jewel, almost as an unthinking reflex. William was the very first to register the sudden shift. The prince looked directly from his wife to the sparkling accessory, and his entire demeanor hardened. This wasn't merely an expensive accessory. This was history pinned to fabric. This was personal mourning brought into the public spotlight. The reception carried immense weight because it wasn't a standard royal gathering. A state banquet is a highly structured official dinner arranged for crucial foreign dignitaries, designed explicitly to demonstrate international alliance, sovereign authority, and national prestige. Charles had desperately wanted this function to project absolute harmony. The monarch needed an image of total stability following weeks of intense internal pressure, and he needed the public to view the institution as completely aligned. Catherine understood those stakes perfectly. She knew exactly how much damage interrupting a highly choreographed court function could cause. Yet, she also recognized the hidden cost of staying quiet. If she remained silent, Diana's memory would once again be buried beneath the weight of court etiquette. William slowly reached over to take Catherine's hand beneath the linen cloth, not to hold her back, but to offer a steadying force. She felt his hand, but gently pulled away. That single, understated movement communicated everything to her husband. The princess wasn't reacting out of sudden anger. She was responding to deep-seated grief. Camilla glanced downward, then raised her head, her expression changing as she realized Catherine had identified the heirloom instantly. Charles observed the interaction as well. The sovereign's features grew rigid, and for the first time all evening, his meticulously managed composure started to break. The room held its breath. Catherine stood up from her seat, and the sudden quiet felt incredibly tense. The catering staff stopped in their tracks. High-profile guests turned their eyes toward the head table. William stood up just a fraction of a second later, positioned close enough to demonstrate total solidarity, yet giving her the space to command the floor herself. Then the princess issued a directive that left everyone stunned. She requested that the entire dinner service be paused immediately. Camilla went rigid. Charles looked back and forth between Catherine and the Queen Consort, recognizing instantly that the damage was already done. This wasn't a minor slip in etiquette. This was the return of Diana's legacy through the one token no person had the right to display casually. And before the assembly could decipher why Catherine had brought the entire evening to a standstill, the individuals closest to Diana's true estate began making it clear what was truly on the line. Inside that hall, the historic jewel held an entirely different meaning for everyone involved. To Camilla, it represented institutional validation. To Charles, it was a volatile reminder of a past era he could never fully escape. To William, it felt like his mother's presence, interrupting the worst possible scenario. And to Catherine, it represented a definitive line crossed right beneath the bright chandeliers in front of the international community. Catherine maintained a stoic posture, but the underlying emotional toll was visible on her face. She had dedicated years to keeping Diana's memory alive with immense tact, never weaponizing it, never using it for media traction, and never letting family mourning turn into a theatrical display. That was precisely why this incident cut so deep. Diana wasn't simply a historical figure in a textbook. She was William's mother, the very figure whose absence defined his internal world, his cautious nature, and the intense way he guarded his inner circle. William fixed his gaze on the brooch, his jaw locked tight. The prince had always protected everything related to Diana with fierce, quiet dedication, particularly the pieces that held major public significance. For him, the family's historical vaults didn't contain simple ornaments. In the subtle language of the palace, an old brooch could serve as an implicit statement, and this specific piece carried an unhealed wound. A grand state function, an official gathering where the royal house represents the nation to global diplomats, is crafted to broadcast total cohesion. Instead, this lone item had transformed a show of solidarity into a source of deep friction. Camilla fought to maintain her public mask. She raised her chin, kept her back straight, and carried on as though nothing unusual had occurred. However, her physical reaction gave her away. The queen consort brushed her fingers against the jewel once, then dropped her hand immediately, realizing that nearly every eye at the upper table had watched the gesture. She aimed for a display of acceptance. She wanted the artifact to show that old wounds had finally closed. Instead, it sent a much harsher message. It implied that someone else's personal history had been taken without authorization. Charles shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his visible distress completely giving away his mood. He was fully aware that this exact brooch was tied to fierce arguments that had already fractured the family behind palace walls. And he also knew that Catherine was simply not the type of person to disrupt an official event without a monumental reason. The king looked toward his eldest son, then towards Camilla, carrying the heavy burden of a past era returning at the exact moment he required absolute order. Catherine felt a wave of sadness, followed by disbelief, then a surge of resolve. She caught William's eye and saw that he was processing the exact same realization. The prince didn't have to say a word. His silence spoke volumes of hurt, and that shared pain gave her the determination to stay standing in a room where she was expected to sit down and play along. Sophie noticed the shifting dynamic before the rest of the guests could piece it together. The close confidant leaned in close to Catherine, speaking in a low, controlled whisper filled with gravity. She quietly noted that this wasn't the first instance where this specific brooch sparked a major internal argument. Catherine kept her eyes fixed forward, but her look shifted. William observed it. Charles noticed. Camilla felt it. That single whisper pulled the entire conflict backward, straight to the hidden event that made Catherine's public stand completely inevitable. This tension hadn't originated at the dining table. It had started weeks prior during a private family meeting where Diana's personal effects were being cataloged for an upcoming public memorial project. Catherine had made one singular explicit request, that the brooch remain securely packed away until William personally decided how it should be handled. But during that closed-door session, Camilla put forward a specific request that turned an intimate memory into a massive royal division. Catherine remembered that afternoon with painful clarity. The meeting at Kensington Palace was highly private, small, and completely shielded from the public eye. A memorial project, a coordinated public effort designed to celebrate an individual's life and ongoing impact, was being organized for Diana, and every single detail carried immense sentimental weight. William arrived at that briefing already incredibly stressed because anything tied to his mother was never mere history to him. It represented his childhood. It represented his ultimate loss. It was the enduring pain behind the official royal smile. Sophie remained close to Catherine, reading the room with practiced composure of an insider who understood the family's invisible fault lines. The close confidant was well aware that the brooch wasn't just another asset in the sovereign collection. A sovereign collection refers to the personal and state-owned valuables maintained by the dynasty, explicitly used for official events, historical preservation, and public representation. The moment the locked velvet container was brought out, Catherine looked instantly at William. The prince didn't reach out to touch it, he merely stared, his heavy silence signaling to everyone present that the heirloom still caused immense pain. Camilla hadn't been there for the initial portion of that meeting, but her name was introduced into the discussion shortly after. According to an official internal record later circulated in a confidential palace debrief, she directly asked Charles if she could display Diana's brooch at the upcoming diplomatic banquet as a public sign of harmony. The Queen Consort genuinely believed the gesture would signal that historical rifts had completely been ironed out, but Catherine viewed the request through an entirely different lens. To her, true harmony couldn't be built by taking a deceased mother's pain and pinning it to a dress for a public audience. William spoke directly to Charles later that evening. The prince made it clear to the king that the brooch should remain entirely out of sight until he personally mapped out its role in Diana's ongoing legacy. Charles took in the words, but stopped short of making a concrete promise. That non-committal silence hurt Catherine far more than an outright rejection would have. She was well versed in institutional stalling. She understood carefully worded evasions, but this crossed a line. The monarch was fully aware of how sensitive the object was, yet he chose to leave the matter unresolved. Catherine discovered Camilla's request through Sophie, who passed along the specifics from an official log maintained by a top court courtier. The princess felt deeply unnerved, not because Camilla sought institutional validation, but because the queen consort seemed entirely willing to extract that validation from Diana's memory. William emerged from that discussion looking profoundly bothered, and Catherine watched him carry that emotional weight silently. That was precisely why the formal dinner became completely intolerable. The moment Catherine spotted the brooch resting on Camilla's outfit, she realized every private boundary had been entirely disregarded. Charles had opted for silence. The queen consort had pushed ahead anyway. William was being forced to confront his mother's painful past in front of the entire world. Therefore, when Catherine stood up from her place, it wasn't a reckless impulse, it was the direct result of a broken promise. The room didn't break out into noise, it went completely cold. Catherine didn't raise her voice, nor did she falter. She simply looked across the table, made direct eye contact with Camilla, and delivered a single question that bypassed all titles, hierarchies, and practiced smiles. "Why are you wearing it?" The words were spoken quietly, but they carried the immense weight of a final judgment. In that exact fraction of a second, the diplomatic dinner transformed into an intense family confrontation. Catherine remained on her feet while the entire room's service ground to a halt around her. A state banquet, in straightforward terms, is the most elite and formal dinner function hosted by the Crown, arranged to welcome international heads of state and exhibit the absolute prestige of the monarchy. That was precisely why her move held such massive institutional weight. She wasn't merely disrupting a private dinner party. She was pausing a highly orchestrated piece of national theater, and every single person in the hall felt the immense risk involved. Camilla attempted to respond with traditional court poise. She raised her head, looked right back at Catherine, and started speaking as though the jewel were nothing more than a standard part of her evening styling. Yet her voice noticeably faltered halfway through her sentence. The queen consort was fully aware that the foreign guests didn't grasp the true gravity of the item. However, the individuals who mattered absolutely did. Catherine knew, William knew, Charles knew, and that reality made her public composure look incredibly thin and vulnerable. William rose to his feet slowly right beside Catherine. The prince didn't talk over his wife, nor did he attempt to downplay her statement. He merely stood tall right next to her, signaling to the entire room that she possessed his absolute backing. His expression reflected the deep personal pain he rarely permitted the public to witness. This was his mother's private history being put on display for a formal event, and he absolutely refused to act like it was just an accidental oversight. Diana's name was never explicitly mentioned, yet her presence dominated the tense silence between them. Charles leaned over toward Camilla and instructed her in a hushed tone to take it off immediately. The king didn't yell, but the absolute authority behind his whisper cut right across the table. Camilla paused for just a single breath, a brief moment of hesitation. Yet that brief pause shifted the entire dynamic. Catherine saw it, her underlying grief sharpening into pure disbelief. William saw it, his jaw tensing instantly. The king registered it as well, his expression darkening immediately, because that brief hesitation looked a lot like open defiance. Catherine wanted institutional dignity, but she also demanded fundamental truth. That was the intense conflict playing out inside her. A part of her wanted to back down, resume her seat, and shield the family from a massive public scandal. But another part recognized that staying silent would allow Diana's profound pain to be turned into mere attire decoration. So she kept her eyes locked on Camilla and completely refused to back down. Camilla finally reached up to unpin the jewel, but the tension had already rippled across the entire room. The queen consort's fingers trembled slightly, a subtle movement that conveyed far more than any official apology ever could. She stood entirely exposed before international guests who had arrived to witness absolute family unity, not an unhealed wound tearing open in real time. Princess Anne walked toward Charles with an expression of absolute cold resolve. The Princess Royal didn't offer him comforting words, she delivered a stark reality check. This is no longer a dispute about jewelry, this is a question of fundamental judgment. The moment Anne identified the core issue, the palace apparatus stopped viewing the banquet as a minor social blunder and began managing it as a full-blown crisis of sovereign authority. Behind Catherine's quiet, unyielding stance lay something the institutional machinery could not override: pure moral authority. She didn't possess a crown yet, she held no sovereign throne, and she had no final say over official palace guidelines. Yet in that specific room, Catherine wielded something far more potent than rigid court procedures. She held the absolute trust of William, the enduring legacy of Diana, and the public reputation of a modern monarchy that simply cannot afford to look entirely unfeeling. Charles grasped that shift before anyone even had to spell it out. The king still retained the crown, and the crown represents the legal, constitutional authority to command the realm. But influence within a family can completely shift long before any formal titles change hands. That evening, true power didn't reside with the reigning monarch, it stood firmly with Catherine because she had chosen to defend a memory the entire nation still held dear. And William stood right beside her because he understood completely that staying silent would have looked like an ultimate betrayal. Catherine sat in an antechamber afterwards, her hands placed neatly together, her expression perfectly composed, though her core was still reeling. She completely refused to walk back or soften a single word she had uttered. The princess was well aware that the palace administration would spiral into a panic over optics, media coverage, international headlines, and traditional protocol. Protocol simply refers to the strict codes of conduct and behavior required at official state functions. But to Catherine, the far more critical rule was basic human decency. Diana's life and history could not be treated as a casual wardrobe option. It couldn't be borrowed to project unearned status, nor could it be used to make deep historical fractures look artificially resolved. William stood by the heavy exit door, meticulously weighing every sentence before going to speak with Charles. The prince didn't launch into a wild, emotional tirade against his father. He spoke with immense control, yet the profound pain beneath his words was completely undeniable. He made it clear to the king that Catherine had stepped up to shield the integrity of the family, not to humiliate it. She had intervened to stop a deeply hurtful gesture from solidifying into a permanent public insult. Charles listened silently, and for the first time, the monarch had no ready-made institutional defense. Anne intervened with trademark sharp clarity. The Princess Royal backed Catherine's actions without an ounce of unnecessary drama, giving Charles a stern warning that powerful symbols can inflict far deeper wounds than spoken words. A public address can be clarified, an official palace memo can be rephrased, but a visual symbol, once broadcast to the world, remains permanently etched in the public consciousness. Anne was well aware that the family had weathered massive storms in the past, yet she also recognized that Diana's legacy occupied an entirely different space. It wasn't simple palace history, it was a matter of national mourning. Camilla's public relations team moved instantly to suppress the fallout. They attempted to frame the choice of the brooch as an act of deep reconciliation, a deliberate bridge designed to connect the past with the present era. But Sophie completely dismantled that narrative with quiet, devastating precision. The close confidant firmly reminded the staff that genuine reconciliation can never be forced upon those who are still actively grieving. If William had never given his blessing, and if Catherine had never agreed to it, then the gesture wasn't an act of unity, it was institutional pressure disguised as a peaceful offering. Charles stared down at the briefing papers arrayed before him, then pushed the documents aside. The king was fully aware that initiating an official palace asset audit, an internal investigation into who accessed specific historic items and who authorized their public use, could uncover a lot of internal oversteps nobody wanted exposed. Even so, he issued the directive. Every single item tied to Diana's personal estate had to be immediately cataloged. Every single sign-off had to be traced back to an explicit name. That mandate transformed the atmosphere instantly, because the burning question was no longer why Camilla had chosen to wear the item, but exactly who within the administration had allowed it to happen in the first place. By the time midnight arrived, the grand palace hallways were no longer filled with majestic ceremony. They were completely silent with underlying panic. Courtiers moved between rooms without exchanging a word. Heavy doors clicked shut quietly. The state dinner had resumed, but only as a superficial show for the remaining guests. Everyone in attendance knew the actual event had already concluded. Camilla had completely removed the controversial heirloom. Catherine had chosen not to return to her designated place at the table, and Charles was left confronting a profound structural reality he could no longer afford to ignore. Charles issued the internal directive with a tone that brooked absolutely no pushback. Diana's personal jewelry archive was to be placed under immediate, total lockdown before any future public appearances could even be considered. A jewelry archive, in simple terms, is the highly secured and official log of historic royal pieces, detailing exactly where they are stored, who holds access permissions, and when they are allowed to be worn. The king recognized the critical nature of this move because Diana's belongings were not standard institutional props. They carried immense public sentiment, deep national mourning, and William's most vulnerable personal history. Catherine sat completely separated from the main banquet hall, experiencing absolutely no sense of personal triumph. The princess had successfully halted the event, but doing so had naturally dragged Diana's memory back into a chaotic world of quiet rumors, administrative panic, and frantic damage control. She had set out to demand basic respect, not a public media spectacle. She had wanted the heirloom protected in private, not pushed into the absolute center of an institutional meltdown. William remained fixed by her side, understanding completely that her public display of strength was costing her an immense amount of internal energy. Camilla sat completely isolated once the heavy doors closed behind her. The queen consort stared blankly at the unadorned fabric on her outfit where the historic jewel had been fastened just hours before, and that empty space felt incredibly conspicuous. She had intended for the heirloom to project total acceptance. Instead, it had radiated deep hurt. She had set out to look entirely secure in her position. Instead, the evening had left her completely exposed, deeply questioned, and acutely aware that certain historical symbols absolutely refused to submit to the individual trying to wield them. The palace press office quickly drafted a highly managed explanation for the attending dignitaries, but no amount of carefully crafted phrasing could eliminate the memory of what had transpired at the head table. A managed explanation refers to a brief, curated statement designed specifically to pacify public curiosity without revealing the true nature of an internal conflict. Charles knew such press lines might salvage the remaining hours of the state visit, but they could never shield the family from its own internal fractures. The king picked up the access log, scanned the sequence of signatures that had cleared the brooch, and then set the document down without uttering a single word. William reviewed the exact same document shortly after, and his expression transformed. The prince had entered the room assuming he would find a single private request, an isolated bad judgment call, or a mistake made in a moment of rush. Instead, he discovered that the brooch had been cleared through far more bureaucratic levels than he ever could have anticipated. That discovery made the entire situation look far less like an accident. It looked organized, it looked entirely permitted, and that realization cut infinitely deeper. Catherine looked toward the closed entrance and arrived at her own definitive conclusion. The princess didn't request another official briefing. She didn't ask for more curated institutional language, more administrative excuses, or further protection from the raw facts. She directly requested an entirely private audience with Camilla, completely free of handlers, free of security details, and entirely clear of anyone who might try to turn personal pain into institutional procedure. William processed the request and stood completely still. Charles heard the directive and looked visibly older than he had all evening. Camilla received the message and quietly lowered her head. And within that closed-door meeting, the night finally stopped being about court protocol and became profoundly human. There were no media strategists in the room, no pre-written statements, and no institutional mask strong enough to obscure what the banquet had completely laid bare. Catherine and Camilla stood face to face, not as the future queen and the reigning consort, but as two distinct individuals standing directly in the long, enduring shadow of Diana. For the very first time that evening, defensive anger completely faded, replaced by something far more formidable: absolute honesty. Catherine walked into the small sitting room with an entirely composed expression, though her internal state remained deeply heavy. A private sitting room, in basic terms, is a smaller, secluded royal chamber utilized explicitly for intimate discussions, completely removed from guests and formal galas. That detail was incredibly important because this was the single room all night where official rank could no longer shield anyone. Camilla couldn't hide behind the grand optics of the state dinner. Catherine couldn't retreat behind a wall of polite silence. The emotional reality of the situation had followed them both right inside. William waited just outside the threshold, completely refusing to step in, yet entirely unable to walk away from the room. The prince knew this specific conversation belonged entirely to Catherine, but he also recognized that the brooch was tied directly to a profound loss that had fundamentally dictated the course of his life. Charles remained at a distance as well. The king understood perfectly that if he tried to intervene, the situation would instantly shift back to a matter of sovereign command, and this was an issue that sovereign command could no longer resolve. This had to be handled on a raw, human level, or it would achieve absolutely nothing. Catherine looked directly at Camilla and spoke with a sense of profound, quiet sorrow. She made it clear to the queen consort that the historic brooch had absolutely no place in a choreographed display of family harmony, because Diana's legacy still carried incredibly raw, living pain. The princess didn't raise her voice even a single octave. She didn't need to. Every single phrase landed with immense weight because it was delivered with absolute composure rather than chaotic anger. She articulated that genuine family harmony can never be manufactured by taking an item explicitly tied to another individual's deep suffering and displaying it to the world. It must be earned over time, quietly, through consistent respect. Camilla initially attempted to explain her rationale. She maintained that her true goal was to display a sense of institutional closure, to show the public that historical divisions no longer dictated the family's internal dynamics. But even as the queen consort spoke the words, her delivery noticeably lost its strength. Catherine listened patiently, then countered with a fundamental truth that cut right through the defense. True validation can never be extracted from someone else's personal tragedy. It cannot be pinned to an evening gown and put on display as a symbol of peace. Camilla looked down. her defensive posture completely dissolved, replaced entirely by a sense of profound realization. She reached over to the velvet box containing the brooch, opened the latch slowly, and lifted the jewelry piece as if the physical object had become infinitely heavier to hold. She then set it down on the table right between them, explicitly stating that she would never feature the heirloom again. Catherine didn't smile, nor did she gloat. She simply gave a firm nod. Because while a verbal promise could never completely heal the historic wound, it could permanently prevent that wound from being exploited again. Camilla understood that reality completely now. The princess recognized it as well. William walked into the room a few moments later and spotted the brooch resting silently on the wooden surface. The prince didn't ask for a breakdown of the conversation. He didn't need to. Catherine's expression made it entirely clear that the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. Camilla's quiet demeanor communicated the exact same thing. And within that profound quiet, the entire evening reached its ultimate turning point. But far beyond the secured perimeter of the palace walls, the private fallout of that interaction was already blowing up into a massive public storm. By the time the sun came up, the inner friction of the royal house had transformed into an absolute national fixation. The visual was splashed across every major outlet. Camilla adorned in tiaras and diamonds, Catherine standing resolutely beside the long banquet table, and William observing the scene with a completely stoic expression. No amount of curated palace press releases could possibly compete with what the public instinctively knew they had witnessed. Diana's memory had actively entered the stateroom, and the public reacted as though a deeply personal historical heartbreak had been abruptly brought back to life. Catherine's name was on the lips of every single commentator before the morning news cycle even peaked. A leading publication featured the close-up image from the dining hall right on its main layout under a stunning headline, "The Brooch That Halted the Crown." A newspaper front page, in straightforward terms, is the primary cover sheet the public encounters before reading any further coverage. And this specific cover held massive power because it transformed a private palace dispute into a definitive national conversation. Catherine wasn't portrayed as erratic or out of line. She was viewed as fiercely protective. She saw a woman completely willing to stand up for Diana's honor in a setting where everyone else expected her to stay completely silent.
William recognized the immense volatility of the situation immediately. The prince was well aware that overwhelming public backing can be an incredibly potent force, but it can also violently reopen personal traumas the family had spent decades attempting to manage and keep private. Outside the gates of Kensington Palace, a quiet assembly began to form, bringing bouquets of white roses and leaving them along the perimeter as a silent show of remembrance. Kensington held massive emotional significance because it was so deeply intertwined with Diana's personal life, and those flowers transformed the unfolding situation from mere tabloid gossip back into a display of genuine public mourning on the streets. Camilla navigated the sudden media storm under immense visible stress. The Queen Consort looked deeply subdued as she exited a private mourning service later that afternoon, and press photographers easily caught the heavy expression on her face. She had set out to secure public validation. Instead, the wider population viewed the move as a sign of disrespect. She had intended to broadcast total cohesion. Instead, the entire country was loudly questioning why Diana's personal heirloom had been displayed on her outfit without obtaining the clear, explicit backing of either William or Catherine first. Charles acted swiftly, but even the authority of the king could not slow down the massive emotional momentum of the public reaction. He personally signed off on an official court bulletin confirming stringent new protocols regarding the preservation and handling of all personal items left behind by Diana. A palace statement is a formal communication issued directly to the media to guide public interpretation, but this specific update carried an incredibly profound underlying message. It served as an open admission that the institution recognized a definitive boundary had been crossed. It also proved beyond a doubt that Catherine's unyielding stand had forced immediate institutional change. A prominent network anchor encapsulated the entire national discussion with a single phrase that immediately went viral. This wasn't an error in wardrobe. This was an error in historical memory. That individual line cut right through every single piece of sanitized palace messaging. It provided the public with the exact vocabulary for what they were already feeling internally. Diana wasn't just a figure from a past era. She remained an active, living component of the nation's emotional landscape, and Catherine had stepped up to defend that legacy the exact moment it appeared most vulnerable to being minimized. Camilla processed the roaring public reaction and retreated even deeper into absolute silence. Catherine took note of the headlines but chose not to celebrate. William observed the national mood and understood completely that the trajectory of the modern house had shifted once again. The public hadn't abandoned their support for the institution. Rather, they had looked straight past the glamour of the crown and demanded fundamental respect for the icon they had never truly forgotten. And when the media noise finally began to quiet down, a single reality remained absolute within the palace walls, far sharper than any official statement. The formal reception had concluded, but its true significance did not diminish. It marked the definitive moment Catherine demonstrated that true dedication to the monarchy does not require absolute silence. It means recognizing exactly when core human dignity has been violated. Camilla completely lost the ability to treat Diana's history as a convenient styling asset. Charles recognized that deep-seated historical trauma can never be managed away through superficial protocol, and William watched Catherine solidify her role as the ultimate protector of something far more valuable than standard palace tradition. Catherine finalized her path forward by the following morning, and it was completely devoid of vindictiveness. The princess didn't demand that Camilla face further institutional embarrassment. She didn't call for public reprimands or another tense, uncomfortable confrontation. She insisted upon one absolute, unyielding rule. Diana's most intimate personal belongings would never, under any circumstances, be brought out without full family consensus. A private protocol, in simple terms, is an internal, binding house rule that dictates how highly sensitive family matters are managed completely away from the public eye. This specific rule carried immense weight because it elevated genuine respect far above public relations and personal convenience. William backed the new boundary with absolute conviction. The prince viewed the mandate as essential protection for his mother's legacy, but also as a critical foundation for the future version of the monarchy they would one day lead. He was fully aware that the crown cannot ask for the public's deep trust if it treats real human tragedy like simple wardrobe jewelry. He knew Catherine had done exactly what most insiders were completely terrified to attempt. She had brought an elite state function to a complete halt, not to damage the family, but to protect the very conscience of the institution. Charles authorized the new operational limits in total, heavy silence. The king grasped that the incident with the brooch had exposed a much larger institutional flaw than a simple scheduling oversight. It had shown how quickly centralized palace management can totally fail when fundamental human emotion is factored out of the equation. He had spent decades attempting to manage historical family wounds through calculated timing, sterile statements, and highly structured public events, but Diana's memory had simply never submitted to administrative control. It remained alive in William, it thrived in Catherine's fierce defense of her husband, it remained anchored in the hearts of the public. Camilla accepted the new boundaries without offering a single word of pushback. The queen consort understood completely that the decision to wear the brooch had cost her an immense amount of personal standing. It served as a stark reminder that true acceptance can never be institutionalized by force, and genuine peace cannot be put on like a piece of jewelry. She had wanted the historic item to permanently close a painful chapter of the past. Instead, it proved that the chapter was still incredibly tender, intensely guarded, and fully capable of bringing the entire room to a standstill. Princess Anne located Catherine later that day and spoke to her with absolute, unfiltered candor. The Princess Royal made it clear to her that her actions at the dinner table weren't a display of rebellion, it was an act of true stewardship. Stewardship means taking absolute responsibility to protect something of immense value for the generations to come, and Catherine had successfully protected personal memory, deep family trust, and the moral integrity of the house in a single, incredibly high-stakes moment. Catherine finalized her path forward by the following morning, and it was completely devoid of vindictiveness. The princess didn't demand that Camilla face further institutional embarrassment. She didn't call for public reprimands or another tense, uncomfortable confrontation. She insisted upon one absolute, unyielding rule. Diana's most intimate personal belongings would never, under any circumstances, be brought out without full family consensus. A private protocol, in simple terms, is an internal, binding house rule that dictates how highly sensitive family matters are managed completely away from the public eye. This specific rule carried immense weight because it elevated genuine respect far above public relations and personal convenience. William backed the new boundary with absolute conviction. The prince viewed the mandate as essential protection for his mother's legacy, but also as a critical foundation for the future version of the monarchy they would one day lead. He was fully aware that the crown cannot ask for the public's deep trust if it treats real human tragedy like simple wardrobe jewelry. He knew Catherine had done exactly what most insiders were completely terrified to attempt. She had brought an elite state function to a complete halt, not to damage the family, but to protect the very conscience of the institution. Charles authorized the new operational limits in total heavy silence. The king grasped that the incident with the brooch had exposed a much larger institutional flaw than a simple scheduling oversight. It had shown how quickly centralized palace management can totally fail when fundamental human emotion is factored out of the equation. He had spent decades attempting to manage historical family wounds through calculated timing, sterile statements, and highly structured public events, but Diana's memory had simply never submitted to administrative control. It remained alive in William, it thrived in Catherine's fierce defense of her husband, it remained anchored in the hearts of the public. Camilla accepted the new boundaries without offering a single word of pushback. The queen consort understood completely that the decision to wear the brooch had cost her an immense amount of personal standing. It served as a stark reminder that true acceptance can never be institutionalized by force, and genuine peace cannot be put on like a piece of jewelry. She had wanted the historic item to permanently close a painful chapter of the past. Instead, it proved that the chapter was still incredibly tender, intensely guarded, and fully capable of bringing the entire room to a standstill. Princess Anne located Catherine later that day and spoke to her with absolute, unfiltered candor. The Princess Royal made it clear to her that her actions at the dinner table weren't a display of rebellion, it was an act of true stewardship. Stewardship means taking absolute responsibility to protect something of immense value for the generations to come, and Catherine had successfully protected personal memory, deep family trust, and the moral integrity of the house in a single, incredibly high-stakes moment. The princess absorbed those words and finally experienced a sense of true internal peace. Not because the historical pain had magically disappeared, but because she had completely refused to let it be swept under the rug. The royal house ultimately weathered the storm of the state banquet precisely because Catherine had the courage to pause it. That was the absolute, enduring truth of the matter. She hadn't diminished the authority of the crown. She had reminded the entire institution what true dignity actually requires. The future of the monarchy could never be constructed by trying to write over the past, and Diana's memory would never again be utilized to validate anyone else's need for institutional approval. No lingering doubts remained, leaving only the permanent historic image of Catherine standing tall while the rest of the hall remained seated, altering the definition of royal duty forever. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.